everybody. I'm going to get us started. Thanks for your patience. We are at 2:02 and I will keep continuing to add people as they come along. Thank you all for joining us. This is really exciting. We're going to be talking about demystifying chaplaincy. And for those of you who don't know me, I am Liz Watkin, the program coordinator for Cherry Hill Seminary. I also do the newsletter. Cherry Hill Seminary, if you're not familiar, is a non-profit leading provider of education and practical training in leadership, ministry, and personal growth in pagan and nature-based spiritualities. Cherry Hill empowers spiritual leadership, scholarship, and ethics through theological and pastoral education to nurture interfaith engagement in a diverse society. I am very pleased to be talking today with Chaplain Wes Isley. Wes is a hospital chaplain and a mentor for Cherry Hill's Community Ministry Certificate Program. He's also done volunteer work as a prison chaplain and holds a Master's in Divinity from Cherry Hill Seminary. For those of you who are involved, please don't be offended if I mute you, because sometimes it can cut out the dialogue of the people that we're here to listen to. So I may ask you all to make sure that you're muted. And feel free to leave your cameras on and off. If you have questions, please pop them in the chat. I've got a number of questions that I wanted to get us started with, and some people who weren't able to attend also sent some questions. So we'll go through those and get to yours as well. And if people have questions, just pop them in the chat box and we'll eventually get to them if they're not answered in the course of the discussion. And I appreciate you all being involved. And I'm going to have Wes talk a little bit for us about his his origin story. How did he come to the path of paganism, and also how he ended up being inspired or compelled to become a chaplain.
All right, thanks, Liz. Hello, everyone. Thank you for taking time to be here. And I'll be as brief as I can for the intro, because I know we have lots to talk about. And I really enjoy chaplaincy and could talk about this probably all day. As far as how I became a chaplain or a pagan first, I was raised nominally Christian, mostly Southern Baptist. But my family was not very big churchgoers, so I had what I like to call an interfaith upbringing, even though I personally was a very devout Christian for pretty much the first half of my life. Then I would say roughly 15 years ago, I started questioning a lot of what I had been taught as a Christian, and I was having spiritual experiences that did not fit into the Christian box, as many of you probably have had similar experiences. So the easiest answer is I listened to my intuition, and I was very inspired by the natural world around me. I lived at the time near a greenway in the city of Greensboro, North Carolina, and really found spirit there in those woods like I did as a child, and that was just wonderful. So I was solitary after that, pretty much a solitary practitioner. Currently I am a member of a voodoo house, a private house here in North Carolina. I've been a member with them for right about 8 years now, and we have our mother houses in New Orleans. But I generally just identify as pagan. I'm not a priest of voodoo. I've been initiated, but nothing official. I was ordained by an interfaith church many years ago in Greensboro, and then was ordained by a Sacred Well congregation 2 years ago. If you're not familiar with Sacred Well congregation, they are a pagan church, I believe now headquartered out of Missouri. They have a pretty good relationship with Cherry Hill, so you may have come across them in some Cherry Hill materials and classes. So as far as how I became a chaplain, I was laid off from a job, my publishing job, which I'd had for quite a long time. And while I was not working, I had the opportunity to attend the Parliament of World Religions in 2015, and that was out in Salt Lake City, Utah. And while I was there, I met a woman who was a volunteer chaplain, and we began talking, and I liked the kinds of things she was talking about, it's kind of the work it was. And then there was a workshop at the conference, or it was rather a viewing of a documentary called Simply Chaplains. And I've got a link to that. You can actually view it on, I think, the full thing on YouTube for free. So I'm going to have Liz send out that link and some others when we're done. And it's got a lot of different kinds of chaplains in it, including the one that I was inspired by was a prison chaplain. She happened to be Buddhist, but in the documentary, she was giving care to a Wiccan inmate. And it was just a wonderful story, very much interfaith. And I thought, this is really awesome. So but I didn't think about it being a job at the time for me. So I enrolled in Cherry Hill and began taking classes, and then took some wonderful chaplaincy classes, and immediately kind of fell in love with the idea of this kind of work. While I was living in Charlotte, which is where I live now, I met a woman at very randomly at a political rally, and she is a chaplain in Charlotte, and she was telling me about what they do, and said, "Oh, well, if you're in seminary, you might consider an internship at the hospital." So I began looking into that, and Cherry Hill gave me a lot of support in this. And so this was a program called Clinical Pastoral Education, which I can talk more about later. But that is how I got into chaplaincy. It was a 6-month internship. And then I survived. And when I graduated with my Master's of Divinity from Cherry Hill, then I began looking into year-long residencies as a chaplain. That's a little bit different. And the main reason I did that is to get some credit toward board certification, which is not required to be a chaplain. But if you're going to be doing this as a paid chaplain and you want access to better paying jobs, board certification can give you a leg up on that. So now I'm working as a resident chaplain in Gastonia, which is a little town outside of Charlotte. I've got about just a little over 3 months left in the internship or the residency, and then I'll begin looking for regular full-time work. So I think that's the brief story.
Now, you may have spoken a little bit about this, but the training that you need to become a chaplain, it sounds like it's a little bit different depending on whether you want to do this in a voluntary capacity versus being paid. And we did have a question that sort of dovetails into this from Heaven Walker, who was asking about the path to chaplaincy based on having a master's in philosophy and religion versus not an MDiv. So is that graduate degree necessary before you do chaplaincy training?
So a couple of things. It depends. The standards for chaplaincy vary depending on the field, such as whether it's hospital chaplaincy, military chaplaincy, etc. Also changes based on whether you're a paid chaplain. There are part-time chaplains who are paid. There are also volunteer chaplains. So it really depends on what you're looking for. If you want to work in a hospital, which is what I'm familiar with the most, then a Master's of Divinity is pretty essential. Now you can be in seminary like I was and begin getting training, that's fine. But for full-time work, you would need to have your master's degree in divinity. Sometimes there are exceptions. They'll take like a master's of theology, which is similar. And as far as volunteering, that's a little bit easier. If you're going to volunteer, like go into a prison, for example, and work with pagan inmates, then your training the more training you have, the better. but it's going to be more about your relationship with um, the head chaplain, who's the staffer at the prison or the jail, or the volunteer coordinator, for example. Any kind of um, like counseling training is helpful. Any kind of disaster training is helpful. The links that I'll give Liz to send out, there are other places to get disaster training as a chaplain through the Red Cross. There's some other opportunities out there if you don't want to go the Red Cross route. And the training is very similar, and they'll give you like a certificate. So anything you have to say, hey, I've got this training and I am qualified to be a chaplain, that's the better. Some places will, like the Red Cross, for example, if you want to be a volunteer chaplain, and this is something I did for a couple years, for the Red Cross, you don't have to have a master's degree, but you do have to be ordained from some recognized faith groups. The Red Cross is actually very, very interfaith and ecumenical and welcoming of pagans. So that's something to look into if that sounds like a kind of chaplaincy you'd be interested in. You have to have their own training once you're approved as a volunteer, but you don't have to have a degree. The military I'm not as familiar with, but in the military's case, you have to be, as far as I'm aware, you have to enlist or be an officer and then go through their own training. You do have to be, I think, ordained, but I believe there are some pagan chaplains in the military. I know it's kind of my general knowledge of that is that it's a little controversial, but there are folks who do it. As far as definitely volunteer, paid pagan chaplains is a little bit different. So that'd be something you have to look into more probably on your own. I know that Cherry Hill has some instructors like David Orgendorf, who's very familiar with military chaplaincy. He's also runs Sacred Well Congregation, which is heavily involved on military bases. So that would be a good resource to look into for that. There are some other opportunities for chaplains. A lot of them, it is heavily Christian, I will say, but pagans are definitely making more of an inroad. So I think that's a good overview of the training. Again, there are some certificate programs. It needs to be something that is specific to chaplaincy, not just saying, "Hey, I'm a priest or a priestess in my tradition," or a pastor or a reverend. That's really not considered chaplaincy training, because the difference there is, I think this is important to know, is that if you're a priest or a minister of some kind, generally you're going to be guiding people on a specific religious tradition, which is very important, obviously. You might have a coven, you might have a Druid Grove or some other group, and you're leading them in that tradition. Whereas a chaplain should be, and increasingly so these days, is someone who is coming from an interfaith perspective, able to give spiritual care to anyone of any religion or no religion. And in the past, chaplaincy was very heavily evangelical, and chaplains would be like the local pastor down the road from the hospital, or that sort of thing. And they would, if you weren't part of their tradition, they wouldn't even talk to you, or if they did talk to you, they'd try to convert you. It's very different these days as far as professional chaplaincy. So that's and chaplains, they're like ministers. They can do some of the same things as ministers do, or priests and priestesses, but you're mostly working with people who are in some type of crisis or a secular environment. It might be a hospital, it might be military, it might be NASCAR, NFL team. Those are some of the more unusual types of chaplaincy, still heavily Christian. But again, they're working with folks who are not really in a church or spiritual group specific kind of context.
That's great. Thank you, Wes. Yeah. So this, I think, would be a really helpful thing to discuss. And that's the actual kind of tasks and activities, the sort of day-to-day things that you would have been doing. We're going to talk about pre-COVID, because obviously things have changed quite a bit. But pre-COVID, when you were doing your work, what were the actual kind of day-to-day things you did, and how has that changed, or what are the tasks and activities you find that you're involved in now that things have altered because of the pandemic?
Mm-hmm. So in some ways, the tasks are the same, but it's different in how you have to do them. So I think with the hospitals in particular, the big difference for us is that we have to wear we had to wear an N95 mask as well as a surgical mask plus a face shield every day, all day, no matter where in the hospital that we go. If we're in a COVID specific unit, then you're also putting on a gown and gloves. But we're really doing the same kinds of things. Now, there are some limitations that vary depending on the hospital. Some hospitals have sort of view their chaplains as maybe not as essential, so they're not allowing them to see certain kinds of patients. But for us, I have a COVID unit at the hospital in Gastonia, so I go in every day and see folks who have COVID. But the kind of things we're doing is the same. I think it's harder for the patients because the COVID patients can't have any visitors whatsoever. So the only people that they see are doctors and nurses and the chaplains. And unlike the medical team, the chaplains we're the only ones who can go in and say, hey, how's your day going? I have nothing to do but come in and talk to you if you would like a visit. There are some changes in that because of COVID, a lot of hospital services, like we would go into a unit and do a blessing of the hands for the nursing staff. And so COVID has kind of cut that out. Although recently I actually did one, and this was not a COVID unit, but we were very careful about taking precautions to take COVID precautions, and I think it worked out fine. But it was a little different in that people had to kind of stand farther apart. There were some things we couldn't do that normally we do, like pass out little things to keep, these sorts of things. But it's really in the bigger picture, it's kind of minimal. We don't hug as often as we might pre-COVID, but if you have gloves on and you have 2 masks and a face shield, it really isn't any different than 5 feet apart from somebody. You have to kind of use your judgment. There's been some COVID rooms I've gone into where the person is elderly and they're mostly deaf, and they're wearing like a BiPAP machine that is loud, and they can't talk and they can't hear you. So how are you going to communicate? So we have a couple, resources where we have like a little board we hold up with signs and symbols to help them communicate what their needs might be in that moment. But then sometimes you still have to get close if they say something that you can't understand, or sometimes they'll reach out your hand as soon as you walk in and they hear you're a chaplain, because that means comfort of some kind. And of course, we've got gloves on, so the likelihood that anything's going to be transmitted is pretty low. And then we follow the hospital regulations for disposing of all that equipment and sanitizing. So things take a little bit more time when you go for a visit, because you have to gown up before and you have to take all that off and dispose of it and that sort of thing. So it really hasn't changed too much. I was trying to think if there's any other examples before or after. We still did, our hospital does Ash Wednesday in the Christian tradition. That's a very important thing for a lot of people. And we still did that. We had a little bit of a different setup where we would go into different units rather than having people come into the chapel and kind of congregate there, because our chapel's pretty small. There's not a really good way to social distance. So a couple of chaplains went to different units. and just took the ashes around, and instead of having large gatherings, just did it more individually. So normally there'd be like a more of a liturgy maybe, or a big kind of group prayer. Those kind of things were done away with, but we still were able to provide some type of ritual and care through that tradition.
So in terms of like a day-to-day routine, or is there a day-to-day routine, or was there? So when you are coming onto your shift, I don't know if that's what you call it, what are the things that you do? And does it vary on the hospital? Because I know some hospitals have different kind of ways of doing it.
Yeah, so I think, well, I'll mention first a little bit on jail chaplaincy, or I guess prison chaplaincy, since I haven't mentioned that yet. I haven't done a lot with that, but it's a little different there because, so I volunteered at a county jail here in North Carolina, and their day-to-day is a little bit different than a hospital. So a lot of what the chaplains do there is passing out literature like Qurans, Bibles, reading material, devotionals, that sort of thing. There are lots of requests that come in every day, and those have to be fulfilled, put into a packet for each inmate, and then distributed to the different cells and floors. So that's something that I would do. They also will request reading glasses, because a lot of the inmates come in, they don't have their reading glasses, or they lose them or something. So we're doing that. And then we would go into, we always go into like a common room, and there's always a guard nearby. And only if there's any concern about safety, it's like any inmate or person who might be a danger isn't allowed to have that kind of service until they've shown that they're not exhibiting that kind of behavior. So we'd go in and pray with folks. Again, most folks are Christians, so they're going to want things like communion. We go in and offer that. Go in and deliver Bibles again, reading materials. And then a lot of what the volunteer chaplains do at the jails is there's a whole huge schedule of classes and workshops. And so I would say if you as a pagan if you're concerned about, folks in jail or prison who might be pagan, there is an opportunity to go into these kind of facilities, and you could offer a class on how do you, honor the goddess when you're incarcerated? How do you honor the spirits? What does it mean to be Wiccan? What does it mean to be Druid, and so on? And you'd have to, of course, submit all that with the staff chaplain, get it approved. Depending on who you're talking to, it could be an obstacle, or you could just sail right through. When I went to volunteer, the staff chaplain was very eager to have someone who was not Christian. And so, I didn't really meet any pagan inmates at the time because I wasn't there that long, but she was perfectly open to that. So that is an opportunity. So and those kind of classes are pretty much almost every day. There's weekend activities that the inmates can go to. There are occasionally like chapel type services, depending on what your faith is. So that's kind of a jail chaplain. For a hospital, it's very different. Most hospital chaplains are assigned to certain floors or units. Like you might have the intensive care unit, you might have the maternity ward, or like orthopedic or pre-surgery, so on. And so you do what's called rounds. You have a patient list every day, and you go, okay, you may have folks requesting to see a chaplain. Or nurses may say, hey, this person's really having a hard time. Would you come by and talk with them? You also might be asked just to see new admission patients who've come in the last day or so, to let them know, hey, if you need a chaplaincy service while you're here, let us know. We'll be happy to come in. So that's kind of how you would kind of round during the day. But as far as practical things you end up doing would be praying with folks from an interfaith perspective, a lot of listening, to what they're worried about, their fears about surgery, or random things about their family. Somebody might be in the hospital with like a serious illness, but they're fine with that. They're more worried about their children or their grandparents. They might be grieving the death of their relative from last year, and because they're in the hospital, that's coming up for them. A lot of people, when they're in crisis like that, all that trauma from the past gets pulled up, and they don't even really know what's going on. So the goal of a chaplain is to go in there and help them find a resource to cope with that. And it might be talking. It might be, can you bring me a Bible? Can we, I'd like to have communion, that sort of thing. Then there's also the more serious things, like chaplains typically get called to a code blue, which is when someone's heart stops and they do CPR. So we respond to those in our hospital in case there are family members there when that happens, because you can imagine if you're in the room with your mother and her heart stops and whole teams rush in and you're stuck out in the hallway, the chaplain is the one who's going to stand there with you until hopefully the person's revived, or if not, then what comes next. We also will round in the emergency department, which is always unpredictable. You might simply take someone, a patient could come in who has to go to the heart cath lab, and they have their wife with them. And so the wife might have a little difficulty walking, so you might get a wheelchair and take her to the waiting room. But then there's folks who come in with gunshot wounds, car accidents, all kinds of things like that. And that depends on which hospital, because the types of trauma you'll get vary. And so there we just provide a supportive presence to the staff, because they can see a lot of intense things. And you deal with people who their loved one comes into the emergency department and they don't make it, and the family is grieving. You might have 20 members of the family who show up even during COVID because people don't think with their logical brains, and in some cases the hospitals don't restrict it if the person has died. And so you've got to manage that and give them some kind of compassion and care. So I'm trying to think what else. I mean, that's kind of you could do any of that in a typical day. It really just depends on what your specific routine is that day. As residents, this is important, as residents or interns, you're often the ones who get the overnight shifts. So you could work, you might work a 12-hour shift overnight or a 24-hour shift. You do have the freedom to go to sleep if the pager or whatever, phone or whatever you're working off of leaves you alone, but you can be all curled up in your bed, and at 3 o'clock in the morning you get a page for a car accident, and you've got to jump up, throw your clothes on, run to the emergency department and deal with whatever happens. And that could take 30 minutes, it could take 3 hours. You might not get back to bed until you get home and the next day and crash for a couple of hours.
That's great. That really does give us a good, I think, a good picture. We've got a couple of questions, and Cynthia, hi Cynthia. She would like, and I think a lot of people would love this. She said she loved the blessing of the hands idea, and if possible, could you share any kind of text or resources that you have around that, if you have any,
okay,
when we get those together. It sounds like there are a lot of rewards and challenges that you have in your role as a chaplain. What are some of those rewards and challenges?
I think the reward is so, and this kind of goes to some of the things that I think you need to be an effective chaplain. So I think the first thing is, in a lot of situations like crises, whether it's working in like a Red Cross shelter or a hospital, or even you're deployed with a military unit or something, you've got to have some maybe crazy impulse to run in the direction that everyone else is running from. um, and that's something you either, I think, have or maybe don't. You can always get better at it. So I think you've got to have that. It's what we call like a non-anxious presence in chaplaincy. You've got to be able to go into a chaotic emergency department and be the calm one when everyone else is freaking out. And you've got to bring that to the staff and the patient, to the family. And when you're able to do that, and so if you're in the hospital and if someone has died and their family is grieving, when you can just be a presence with them and give them some support, you let them cry, you let them question God or whatever their faith is without judgment. You might pray with them. You might bring them a bottle of water because they've been crying and they're dehydrated or something. They might want a snack. They might need a wheelchair ride. Those kind of things can be really rewarding. I was thinking of a particular story recently. I saw a woman who has COVID, and she was a very devout Christian and had been her whole life. She was probably in her 60s, and she was worried though. She was in the hospital, and she didn't seem that worried about COVID, but she didn't feel God's presence. So, what do you do? Right. So we talked. I explored the things that were important to her in her spirituality, times in the past when she had felt God's presence. And eventually we talked about music. She loves gospel music. And the hospital TVs have music channels. And I was like, oh, well, have you found these music channels yet? There might be one here that you enjoy. Well, wouldn't you know it, they wouldn't work at that time. But then I thought, oh, well, I'll just play something on my phone. I said, well, what's your favorite gospel hymn? So she tells me this song. It was a very old sort of like country Southern Baptist, which is it's how I was raised. So I'm already cringing because I can't handle that stuff anymore. But I played it for her on the phone. And she was one of these folks who had like this machine on. It was very hard to understand her. And we're playing the song and she starts crying. And at first I was worried that it was too much for her. And so I asked her, I was like, would you like me to stop? And she said no. So we played the song. I find myself humming along to the song, just to the melody. And I'm like, just go with it. It's Southern Baptist, but it won't kill you. And when the visit was over, and she was still crying, and she's like, thank you so much. I feel God's presence. And I'm not a Christian. She didn't even know I was pagan. But just to facilitate that kind of connection, like that just meant the world to me. And it was, and I didn't even go in there knowing what was going to happen. So that's kind of rewarding. As far as challenges, I think the biggest challenge is being a pagan in a predominantly Christian context. And everyone assumes you're Christian. Everyone's going to assume you're heterosexual, you're gender normative, you're Christian, you're conservative, or whatever kind of their own sort of ideology is. They're going to put that on you, and so you've got to kind of deal with that. And there's a whole skill to doing that, but it is challenging because you're expending your energy on this, and it's a trick to hear things sometimes that offend you, upset you, bother you, and it's not about me. It's not about the chaplain. It's about that patient or that staffer or whoever. And there are times when you can talk about those kinds of things and be honest and open with folks. You have to use your own judgment. And there's no rule really, but you also have to be prepared for what their answer might be, how that might be perceived, and is that you have to weigh the pros and cons of, like, if I say this, how is it going to affect this encounter? Is it going to facilitate our connection as people, or is it going to maybe sever that? And sometimes maybe it's okay to sever that connection. You just have to kind of be prepared for that.
I think that's a very interesting point, and it does speak to the fact that there is a difference between ministry and chaplaincy, that chaplaincy requires you to be in places where you are going to be interfaith, whereas if you're doing ministry, for example, it's possible that you're going to be within your tradition and within your faith path. So I think that's a very good point to remind people, is that being an enthusiastic pagan can sometimes be difficult in chaplaincy, particularly where so many of us have that. I totally related to your kind of trigger with the Christian music, because I have similar ones as well, because my father was a minister, a very nice minister, but still still a Christian minister. Other skills that are helpful, we talked a little bit about the qualities of calmness, and I thought that was a really interesting point, very good point. What other kind of, maybe, I know that we sometimes call them hard and soft skills. Soft skills, don't really say that. Is that those things that you were discussing, but also kind of other things that perhaps people maybe don't realize that are helpful when you are doing this kind of work?
Yeah, I think, well, one of them, I sort of talked a little bit about this, is so in addition to the being non-anxious, it's important to enjoy being in an interfaith setting. You have, like I said, I came from more of an interfaith background, and so I was always interested in what other people believe and how they express their spirituality. So, in addition, although like my hospital is predominantly Christian, there are Muslims, there have been some Buddhists, some Hindus, so different kinds of, you'll have everybody from very high church Episcopalians to Pentecostals, and you have to come from a place of curiosity. So if you're a curious person and you value the different kinds of spirituality and how they're expressed, you can find things that you have in common. You don't have to really leave yourself at the door, but you have to look for what you have in common with those other people. I don't go in there and talk about voodoo, for example, but there's a lot of things in voodoo that are very similar to Pentecostal type churches, holiness churches, even though they would just be mortified if I said that to them. And then, so you have to be able to relate to people with what you share. There's another thing too, is you do have to set aside your own theology, and that's something that you can learn. I mean, there's ways to do that. And I don't want to go into too much, but I kind of think you get the idea of, like, even though I was a pagan going into that woman's room who had COVID, and she was a Christian, we were able to find something in common, and it didn't really matter what I believed or what she believed. It's like we found something that could help her cope in that moment. And I think you've got to have empathy for people, and that's a very broad skill. You've got to be willing to listen. You've got to find it's not about going in and fixing people, because you might see someone for 10 minutes if you're lucky, and in that 10 minutes you can't fix them. You might help them cope a little better, but you can't bring their loved one back from the dead. You can't cure their terminal cancer. You can't convert them, even though if you think, oh, if they only were a pagan, they could deal with this so much better. You can't do that in 10 minutes. And believe me, you will, any kind of chaplaincy, I think you could see some toxic theology that I feel is actually making their situation worse. But that's not really my job to go in there and do that. You have to be empathetic for where they are at that moment, and just show some humanity. And it's okay to bring your own experiences in there. Like if you've had a lot of grief in your life, you'll probably know what it's like, what kind of experience you're going through. If you've had some kind of trauma, if you've lost a child, or you've had a certain kind of disease, like a chronic disease you've dealt with, you might have the same kind of person, and you're talking with them and you're like, can I share this with you? I actually have this same problem and here's what I do. That's fine. Those kind of real soft kind of skills are great, and they're different for everybody. Some chaplains really like ritual, and some chaplains like more, kind of asking questions and talking through things. Any kind of, counseling skills are helpful, but you're not a psychologist, you're not a counselor, that you're going to see this patient for a long term. Now, the only difference is if you're in a jail or prison, yeah, you'll probably see that person over and over again. So that's a little bit of a different context. And if you're a military chaplain, you would see the same people again and again. So that's more a little bit of different skill than being in a crisis situation like a hospital or a disaster shelter. Especially disaster shelters, when I did some with the Red Cross, I mean, you've got to just be thinking of like, what does this person need? Are they cold? Are they thirsty, hungry? Even though that's not like a chaplain's job to necessarily feed someone, but you can go get them something if they need something in the moment. Maybe the meal line's already shut down, but where there's some potato chips or something, or there's a teddy bear for their child and the child's crying, and you happen to walk by and struck up a conversation. Just those real kind of empathetic, human connection kind of skills are so helpful. And it's like you can learn some of this, because in a way I'm very shy actually, but I found that this kind of work, because I enjoy it, it kind of brings me out of myself, and I find myself doing things that I never would have thought I would ever be doing.
That's a good point, because I think a lot of people do think it's a people like an extrovert sort of thing, and that might not necessarily be the case. And it might be as well that because you have that structure of specific things that you can do for people, there's more parameters around the interaction too, perhaps.
Right. And one thing that I haven't really talked a lot about as far as like things you might do as a chaplain or skills is what we call advocacy. So, you might come across a patient who is homeless and they're not sure where they're going to go when they're discharged from the hospital. Or you might have someone who was in a car accident, but they also have a drug abuse or substance abuse problem. And this is kind of, maybe they're realizing, I need to get a handle on this. Can you find me a support group? So a lot of it's working at the hospital anyway, working with interdisciplinary teams like social work and so on, who they know the resources in the community, but they may not know that patient needs something. So if a chaplain hears that, you go, hey, contact social workers, see what you can do. Another thing too is if you have a patient who is Muslim, or a staff person who's Muslim, and it's Ramadan, like it's currently Ramadan, and maybe they're how can you work with the staff to accommodate some of their dietary needs during Ramadan? Or maybe they need a kosher meal. They're Jewish and they'd like a kosher meal, and the nurse hasn't followed up on that, or she's not aware of it or something. Those kind of advocacy things are really important. Trying to think of anything else. I can't think of anything with disaster chaplaincy per se that I've experienced, but sometimes families in the emergency department, the way they grieve culturally is different than the way you grieve, or the hospital staff. Some families will come in to see their loved one who's died, and they spend 5 or 10 minutes and they're good. Other families come in and they're there for hours, and it's full on, drama and emotions, and and you have to advocate on behalf of them to be able to grieve. And lots of parameters and all that, lots of details and stuff. I won't go into that, but that really is advocating for the family, because some doctors and some nurses see that and it stresses them out, and they don't like, why are they doing that? Why do they have to do that? And it can really it can expose a lot of prejudice and bias on the behalf of the staff. So that's something that, you know, you might find yourself in the middle of. And when you're in that role as a chaplain, it's I don't know, I guess it's, you know, it's because you care about the family and the patients. It's something that, okay, I've got to go do this. I'm much more willing to step up and say something than I normally would if I was just a, you know, casual observer or something.
That's really a good point too. I do want to get to some of these questions that people are putting in the chat, and one of them is from Francesca, and the question is, if someone is ordained, and we did talk about this a little bit, but maybe we do need to kind of clarify the idea of having a graduate degree in philosophy and religion. Is it recommended that you still pursue a master's in divinity as well? Which I think is a good point. And I think we sort of said it kind of depends really on where you're going to be a chaplain and whether you want to be a volunteer versus whether you want to be paid. It sounds like it varies.
Right.
I'm Francesca. The question was like, I've got a graduate degree, philosophy of religion, and I'm ordained.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. Sorry, my typing skills are not, my typing force is not good. But yeah, should you go for the full Masters of Divinity? Could you sort of do an on-the-job training working with the Red Cross or a local group?
Mm-hmm. Well, Francesca, I would say, you know, if you're going to be, if it's hospital chaplaincy you're interested in, or hospice, because there are hospice chaplains too, most of them do require a Master's of Divinity. You might, however, look for some chaplains in whatever city you live in, and email them and say, hey, I'm curious about this. In your case, did you have to have a Master's of Divinity? A lot of, if you look on some job sites like Indeed or things like that, they'll list qualifications. You can just kind of search and see what qualifications are. I would just encourage you to spend a little time kind of digging around and see what's required. The military is pretty good about just listing exactly what you need for chaplains in general. And again, I've got some resources that we'll email out that may answer some of the questions more specifically. You know, if you could certainly be a volunteer chaplain with your background. I think because being ordained, for example, if you wanted to volunteer for the Red Cross, ordination is required. You don't have to have a master's degree. You might need to take some kind of certificate chaplaincy training initially, and then you'd be qualified for Red Cross. But again, that's volunteer work. But if that's what you're looking for, that might be fine. You could probably volunteer in a prison or a jail setting, because they're going to more be concerned about you're ordained, because it means there's a religious body of some kind, whether it's pagan or not, who said, okay, we have vetted this person. They've gone through some kind of process to be ordained. So therefore you have some authority and some training that they will recognize. Again, you might have to show some other kind of spiritual care training, but you can get some of this online. It doesn't have to be prison or jail specific. And usually they don't require degrees.
There is a resource that I've dropped in the chat as well, Francesca, that I found really helpful, called chaplaincyinnovation.org, and they often
they're great
workshops. I think they're under Brandeis, and they've done some really wonderful workshops where they talk about the different requirements, and they have people interface from all sorts of different backgrounds, and they're also very honest to talk about the pay versus the amount that you're investing and so on. So I would recommend that as well, so that you can kind of get some clarity over the different kind of qualification paths that are there. This is a great one from from Audrey. I apologize. And this was one that came to me as well. What self-care or routine do you have to release the stress and trauma you encounter so it doesn't follow you home? That's a really good question.
Yeah, very good question. So it's ongoing. That's another sort of challenge of, particularly I would say, hospital chaplaincy and disaster chaplaincy, because you're seeing people in crisis, and trauma is contagious. And so what I do is I try every day to have some kind of meditative or spiritual practice, like ritual, or even if I just take 5 minutes in the car and do some breath work. I make sure to eat well and try and get sufficient sleep. And one thing I do whenever I have an overnight shift and I come home and I've had, it could be several patients or a handful of patients die. I'll come home. I have a little shrine area with various altars. I'll go in there. I light a candle for the folks who died, who I cared for. I make an offering to the spirits of the dead that I work with, and thank them for accompanying me. I do like a little cleansing, I use a feather and sort of cleanse, however you want to, like my energy field or whatever you want to talk about like that. And I try to talk to my colleagues about what's happening. I do go to therapy, because therapy is a good place to kind of get all this out, because when you experience someone else's trauma, it can bring up stuff for you that you've experienced, and you're like, wow, I didn't think it would affect me like that. And then 2 days later, you're struggling to provide care because your own history, your own trauma or something is being stirred up. So it's important to be self-aware, and it can be any number of things. It doesn't have to be anything big, or you don't have to follow the same routine, but just recognizing that and responding to it is the most important.
We have a couple of questions that Cynthia had. You'd emailed me, and I think we have another one with you here. So there is, she asks about whether you facilitate a funeral or other rite for patients and families. But she also had another question, if we've got time to fit it in, where she said, do you remember the first in-your-face moment when the knowledge that you were a pagan in a chaplain setting came to life? And you did touch a little bit upon the kind of interactions with people and choosing your battles, in a sense.
Yeah.
Were staff encounters different, or was there a kind of an othering that occurred because of the knowledge that you were pagan?
Yeah. So the first question was, can you help me remember about? I forget.
Yes, I'm sorry. So the first one was whether you have done funerals or other rites for families and people and patients.
No, we don't do any kind of funerals, because that's not going to take place in the hospital. I mean, I've done them on my own outside of that context, but not as a chaplain. So the closest thing we would get to in a hospital is if someone is close to death, they might want something like last rites, like from the Book of Common Prayer, or they might want there's a blessing of the sick in the Catholic tradition. We can do that kind of thing, or we can call in a priest. We can call in someone locally. Pre-COVID, that happened all the time. During COVID, it's been hit or miss, and it's starting to be relaxed now. But you explain to them, I'm not Catholic or whatever, but I'm happy to read this for you. Or you can even get someone on the phone. Like if you can read something, or you could anoint the person with oil or water while their priest is on the cell phone reading the actual liturgy and sort of making it official in their eyes. We've also, the most tragic is when a child is stillborn, or there's what they call infant demise, or not infant demise, but fetal demise, which is more like a miscarriage. A lot of families want something, a ritual around that. So we'll do those kinds of things, but nothing like a full-blown funeral.
And then there was the other question from Cynthia was about any in-your-face moments or kind of situations where it was kind of, you're pagan and maybe it may have become an issue.
Yeah, there are two that come to mind. One, there was a woman who was close to death, and she was Episcopalian, and it was in the middle of not in the middle of the night, but it was in the evening, and she wanted last rites, and it was kind of a complicated situation. She was by herself in the hospital, but in the process of trying to do this, I got her priest on the phone, who was lovely, and her next of kin, who was not like a daughter, but some other relation. And the priest and I were talking, and she was fine with me doing this, and we were going to try to do the cell phone and all this thing. And then the relative, though, was very curious. Well, what church do you? And she assumed I'm Christian. She goes, what church do you go to? So I always say, well, at the hospital we provide care to everyone. We don't represent a specific church. But she wanted to know what church I was a member of. So I was like, well, actually, I'm pagan. I wasn't gonna, I had different responses different times. So in that case, she was like, oh, well, I don't think I want to do this. So in hindsight, so we actually, I went back and prayed with the patient. In hindsight, I talked to my supervisor about this. This was very early when I started working, and I didn't want to violate any kind of boundary there. But my supervisor explained, well, the relative wasn't in the hospital. The patient was the one who wanted it. And I had explained to the patient that I wasn't Episcopalian, and she was okay with that. I didn't have to tell her I was pagan or Lutheran or whatever. And so I regret not just going ahead, and her priesthood was okay with it. So I regret doing that. I don't regret saying I was pagan, but I could have just hung up the phone and went back in there and done it, and no one would have known. One other time was I was having a great conversation with a couple in the hospital. Wife was a patient, husband was visiting, and we were going to pray, and everything was going fine. And I knew they were more conservative, but it wasn't an issue or anything. And all of a sudden, just out of the blue, he says, well, tell me, Wes, do you know the Lord? And he said, or is your theology like pantheistic? I'm like, oh, wow. How did he pull that word out of his hat? So I don't know what gave him the impression that I am pantheist, but okay. So I thought, well, I'm not going to play a game here with the guy. So I just said, well, yeah, I actually do have more of a pantheist theology, and I happen to be pagan. But here at the hospital, we provide care to everyone, blah, 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 went through the whole spiel. And he was very condescending at that point. And I mean, he didn't say anything rude, but it was that Southern way of being rude, but being nice about being rude. And but I don't take it personally. I was like, fine, okay. I can refer him to a Christian chaplain. So we ended the visit. I didn't say a prayer or anything. It was, in the moment, it was very unsettling. And it's been a while now, so I can kind of laugh about it. But the key is you don't want to argue with folks. You don't want to make it about you. You just kind of, if it's too much, just get out of the situation and respect because they have a right to do have care or no care or whatever. So you just kind of step out of it and move on.
I think that I love that story, and I live in the South. I'm not from here, but I know exactly what you mean.
And I do have, if Francesca if she's still on the call, she may appreciate this. Speaking of degrees, just real quick, I had a funny story because a lot of people don't really know what a chaplain does or what it takes to be one. So I was talking to a nurse at the hospital, and she was real curious, and she was asking about, well, do you have to go to college for that? I said, yeah, in my case, yeah, you do. You have to have. She goes, oh, okay. And she thought I meant like an undergraduate degree. I said, oh no, we have to have a master's degree, to work here. And she's like, and she's real Southern, real cute, and like perky blonde and all this. And I had to do it with her accent. She goes, really? You have to have a master's degree just to tell people about the Lord? So I'm like, yes, just to tell people about the Lord, you do. Because that's what she thinks. And I could have had a moment of like educating her, but she was running one direction. So I was like, no, next time.
Considering some of the people that have tried to tell me about the Lord, I'm going to say that it may not be a bad idea to get them to get a graduate degree, honestly. Right. I do. And I have a question that is a bit more kind of pragmatic that was from Claire Levioki, who isn't here. And if people need to leave, and Wes, are you okay to stay just for?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
She had a very good question about kind of compensation in terms of like working in a hospital setting, and she said that she'd worked in a hospital setting and worked in evenings and weekends and was often on call, and she wondered how that worked for chaplains, because she often saw chaplains at kind of what sometimes people call unsociable hours, late at night. And how is that structured in terms of time spent at the hospital and compensation? You talked about being on call, the fact that you might have to kind of get up at 3 a.m. So how does that work in terms of like your compensation?
So in my case, if you're a chaplain intern, first of all, like I was briefly, you don't get paid for that, but you're only there maybe 10 hours a week. Okay. And you're getting this for credit, probably for school credit and so on. So you're getting compensated in a different way for internship. A residency is paid, but the pay is pretty low because you're also getting usually educational credit as well. And it's limited to usually 1 year at a time. So now I do have full benefits as a resident chaplain. I have health insurance. I've got some time off, not a lot of time off, but some, because it's just 1 year. For residents at hospitals, your compensation for a year is usually like around 30,000, 30 to 35, sometimes even a little less. Every hospital is a little different. They all have their different budgets and sources of funds and so on. Now, I would not do that more than a year, but there's certain reasons I'm doing it temporarily. And then we usually interns and residents are the ones who are doing the overnight shifts, and we just know that's part of the deal. Now, if you're hired as a full-time regular staff chaplain, you're not doing overnights. You work a 40-hour week. That's it. The compensation there depends on your market, your hospital. If you're a big fancy research hospital like, I don't know, Wake Forest Medical Center in Winston-Salem here in North Carolina, or UNC Chapel Hill, you're probably going to be looking at like closer to, I don't know, 50, 60, 70,000 a year. Where I'm at, it's probably going to be a little lower than that. It just depends. But you're going to have your full benefits and all that kind of thing. The residents and chaplains do work hours. They're also part-time chaplains who have already done their residency, for example. But they want to work part-time. So they'll often work overnight, and they're paid by the hour. I don't know what their hourly rate is, actually. I haven't looked into that. But you might get, you might work 10 hours a week. You might work 5 hours a week. It just varies as whether you're needed or not. But usually that's a person who's going to come in overnight. And if you're a part-time like that, you probably don't have any benefits or anything. You hopefully have some other full-time job or maybe you're on a spousal insurance policy, something like that.
Thank you so much, Wes. We are at 3:00. Let's see. Let me check my clock has disappeared. Where are we?
7 after.
3:07. Thank you.
Yeah.
And does anybody have any final kind of questions before we kind of wrap this up? This has been really helpful, Wes. I really appreciate. I found it fascinating. So
yeah, and I will send you this document I have with a lot of resources. There's great stuff out there if you got some time to just spend if you want to, Liz, if you want to share my email, I'm fine with answering people's questions, as I'm able.
That's very, very nice of you. I think what I will do is, for all of the people that were signed up, I'll send out like a little resource pack, and it might have, the stuff that you send, and then we'll put your email address in there as well, just in case people want to ask you questions. That would be really helpful. Thank you. And Holly, did you want to kind of share anything before we sign off?
I just want to say thank you both. This was excellent. And special thanks to Wes for sharing your expertise and background. I also want to say there will be another free program on Saturday, June 26th. That will be part of our Coming to the Center lecture series. Katrina Messenger from Washington, D.C., part of DC Connects and Reflections Mystery School, long time, very respected pagan elder. She will share with us on the topic of, I should have gotten it in front of me, racism, white nationalism, and capitalism, and how they have diminished us spiritually. And as I've said to somebody recently, I would listen to Katrina tell us her recipe for brownies. She's just really, really good and has a strong voice of spiritual authority, I'll say. We'll have another one in the fall. I've forgotten the date, but it's October. Don Frew will be talking to us then about his work around the world with lost and endangered religions. So watch for your notice. We will put anybody who's new here today onto our email list. So if you get something and you don't want to get those anymore, just click the unsub at the bottom, but you will see announcements for these lectures. Thank you. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of the weekend.